Okay, let's try this again. I was muted. So thank you, everyone, for joining us for this discussion on reporting on Gaza and Israel and the risks that journalists face reporting on this conflict and other conflicts. I'm Musa al-Gharbi, Assistant Professor of Communication and Journalism in the School of Communication and Journalism at Stony Brook University. I'm joined today by Jodie Ginsberg and Sarah Baxter. Let me fold both of them into the conversation. So let me start with Jodie. Thank you for joining us. So you're the president of the Committee to Protect Journalists. For those unfamiliar, can you tell us a little bit about the CPJ and its work?
Certainly. So the Committee to Protect Journalists does exactly what it says on the tin. We try to ensure that journalists can report safely across the world by documenting threats and attacks on journalists, by providing direct assistance to journalists. It may take the form of digital security advice, physical safety advice, or direct grants to journalists, financial grants, and by advocating on their behalf. So being to ensure journalists unfairly detained or released from jail, or against unfair and restrictive media laws worldwide. And that's how we work, and have been doing that work for over 40 years. We're based here in the US.
As I understand it, you just returned from Jordan after attending a conference for Arab reporters for investigative journalism. On Twitter, X, formerly known as Twitter, you noted that at the conference, you were, quote, privileged to listen firsthand to Palestinian journalists describing their experiences covering the war. The grief, dread, and despair, and the sense of abandonment, you said, is overwhelming. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you heard and what you observed while you were talking to Palestinian journalists at this conference?
Yes, as you say, I was very lucky to have been invited to speak at a conference in Amman that was entirely attended by journalists from the Middle East region, and the sense of grief there is really palpable at the numbers of journalist colleagues who have been lost in this war. If I just give you some numbers very quickly, so CPJ has documented 63 journalists killed in this war. That's in the space of less than 3 months, and that compares to 68 journalists and media workers who we documented as having been killed in the entire 12 months of last year globally. So that just shows you the scale and the unbelievable and unimaginable pressures that journalists are operating under. Never in the 30 years that we've been documenting attacks on journalists have we seen this number of journalists killed in such a short space of time in any conflict. And of course, that that's not to mention the the injuries, the challenges, which I know we'll talk about, of reporting. So there's a huge sense of grief for people's colleagues, of people. These communities are very small. People know one another. That they're having to listen to the most harrowing stories of colleagues who have no food, who've had to report on their loved ones being killed, who've got no shelter, who fear that they may wake up tomorrow, or they may not wake up tomorrow, that they may be killed. So there's a huge sense of grief for the colleagues and frustration, but also frustration that a feeling that perhaps the international community hasn't come to their defense, hasn't come out publicly in their defense. A number of funders, for example, have cut funding to media organizations whom they've been funding for decades in Palestine. And all of that it is felt very, very keenly in the region. And I think it's really striking because it's often very challenging to really understand that depth of feeling when you're reporting from outside. We always talk, I think, as journalists about why it's important to have people on the ground, and that's one is that when you're hearing these stories third or fourth hand, they don't have anything like the impact when you're seeing them for yourselves, or when you're talking to people who've had direct experience of them.
Yeah. Phil, can you pull up an article on my so there are a number of recent cases where prominent Palestinian journalists have been struggling with the kind of despair that you described. These questions about is anyone listening? Is their work making a difference? Concerns about whether they'll even be able to live and continue to report the next day. As reported in Siyasat, there were two prominent journalists recently who kind of gave goodbyes in a way, expressing concern about whether they would be able to continue reporting. So, Sarah, let me turn to you briefly. You've worked as a foreign correspondent for the Sunday Times, and you've reported from Gaza in the past. You now direct the Marie Colvin Center for International Reporting here at Stony Brook. For those unfamiliar, who was Marie Colvin, and how does her story fit into the work that the center does and the conversation that we're having today?
Thanks, Musa. Well, Marie Colvin was a colleague of mine at the Sunday Times of London. And in 2012, she was killed. She was deliberately shelled by the Syrian forces during the Syrian civil war. In other words, she was targeted by President Assad and his generals because they didn't like what she was reporting. At the time, this was a huge shock. And it did send a real message to journalists that they were no longer safe. It was her commitment to reporting on the truth at ground level that really made her such an icon. You know, I know that on October the 7th, she would have wanted to be in Israel, hearing the stories of what happened to people on those kibbutzes on that day when people were massacred, women were raped, children killed. But she would equally want to be in Gaza now, where it's practically impossible for Western journalists to get access. She would want to be there telling the story of the victims of war. That was her concern. It was giving voice to the powerless, the voiceless, not telling the story of politicians and the generals and their debates. She always wanted to hear from the victims of war, no matter what side they were on. And I think everybody who knows Marie or who has read her work just misses her reporting so much. She would want to be there now in the Middle East.
In your own work as a foreign correspondent, you relied heavily on folks who lived in the countries that were being reported on, often people who don't have an easy option for exit, who have a lot of skin in the game with respect to the stories that's different from the journalists, from the foreign correspondents themselves, or the audiences who might be reading their stories. And often the people that you rely on face significant risk, potential retaliation or suspicion for working with foreign journalists. Can you talk a little bit about the constellation of local media workers who enable foreign correspondents like yourself to do the work that you did while you were reporting from Gaza?
Yes, when I was in Gaza many moons ago, I was very reliant on a reporter for Reuters who worked inside the Gaza Strip. He introduced me to all the leaders of Hamas. He introduced me to people on the ground, women in refugee camps and so forth. And you know, I'm rather ashamed to admit it, although I did mention him in my article. He didn't get a credit, he didn't get a byline. This is a very old-fashioned way of thinking now, but it still goes on. You know, quite a sort of an old imperialization in a way. You know, Westerners fly in, they use everybody on the ground for material and sourcing, and then they fly off again and get the credit. What we're seeing in Gaza is so many great journalists on the ground who are local, who are Palestinian, who are acting for the first time as the acknowledged eyes and ears of everybody who reads Western media. And they're the ones who are getting hammered, who are trying to report while under fire. There have been journalists, I should say, who've been killed in Lebanon and in Israel as well. But the vast majority of news that we're getting out of Gaza are from people who used to be called fixers, stringers, and so forth, who are now getting the bylines that they deserve, reporting, perhaps not all of them actually, but at least in some mainstream newspapers are, and who are doing all the heavy lifting for everything, every piece of news that people in America, Britain, and all over the world are hearing from Gaza.
I should add, so initially, as you and I were planning this conversation, in addition to Jodie, we had initially hoped to have a Palestinian journalist join us remotely for this conversation, Amal Hellis of the Sunday Times. However, it proved impossible logistically for her to join us. However, on X, formerly known as Twitter, Amal did provide the Times with a short video showing a slice of her life reporting in Gaza. And I'd like to play that now, if you can cue that up for me.
Jesus.
Yeah, it appears as though we're having some technical difficulties with the sound and getting the audio to play. So I'll have Sarah briefly describe the video and
Well, what we've just seen there is Amal Heles, who effectively is the Marie Colvin of today, acting for the Times and Sunday Times of London in Gaza. She starts off by describing herself as a local journalist, but really she's addressing the world. And she's talking about the conditions of life there. But you can see on screen that she's hugging her children. She's talking about going and reporting on the conditions in hospitals in Gaza, on the conditions of pregnant women, going home, hugging her children, holding them close. And you can hear bombs going off. The roof of her house shakes. And in the distance, you can see smoke. And she says very movingly that her children are learning words like ceasefire, bombs, taking cover, and all the sort of things that children should never need to know about. But that's the day-to-day reality of her life in Gaza.
Jodie, so, journalists reporting from Gaza face a number of challenges, some of which the audience would have been able to see in the video, such as limited access to electricity or internet, which makes it difficult often to communicate with the outside world, difficulty securing food, potable water, reliable shelter in many cases. But of course, this conflict has not just been logistically challenging for journalists in Gaza, it's also been exceptionally dangerous. You've talked a little bit about some of the casualty statistics, sort of top line casualty statistics for this conflict. Would you be comfortable sharing a little bit more information from SoCJ's data on journalists who have been killed or injured in this conflict? Who's being injured, who's being, et cetera, whatever additional details you might be willing.
Of course. So as of today, we have documented 63 journalists and media workers killed. 56 of those are Palestinian, 4 Israeli, and 3 are Lebanese. So the vast majority of those killed are Palestinian, and largely killed in airstrikes or strikes from Israeli fire. The 4 Israelis that were killed during the Hamas attack on October 7th. The thing I think it's important to remember about this conflict is how small Gaza is, right? It's a really tiny strip of land. And unlike other conflicts or wars that we might be familiar with, and sort of the familiar image of say, war correspondents being, on one side or the other, there is no safety in Gaza. There's nowhere that you can go to that is a place of safety. And so journalists, as we saw in the clip, are trying to report on the impact of the war and the day-to-day reality, while at themselves, at the same time, being under potential fire because hospitals are being bombed and roads are being bombed. And so it's impossible to operate safely. There's no sort of line to hide behind. Famously, you may remember a few weeks ago, a journalist took off their flak jacket, the kind of familiar flak jacket. I think you sort of had one as your opening image, and helmet, and said, "This doesn't protect us anymore. There's nothing. This isn't going to keep us safe." So that's the kind of circumstances under which those in Gaza are operating. And on top of that, I think it's really important to keep stressing this. The point that Sarah made is, until the Israeli Defense Forces allowed journalists to come in with the Israeli army, there were no international journalists. They were not allowed into Gaza. So the only people giving us any information, taking the pictures, recording people speaking, making reports were Palestinian journalists. And many of those are not war correspondents. They're local journalists to whom war has come and who have forced, therefore, to become war reporters. And they're doing all of that, reporting on potentially the killing of loved ones, the death of loved ones, in an unsafe environment where there's no food or limited amounts of food, limited amounts of fuel, often difficult to get a signal. We've seen a number of power cuts and cuts to telecommunications. So on some occasions, we get no information out whatsoever. So we as the international community are entirely reliant on those journalists bringing us the information about what's happening inside Gaza.
If I can in here as well, I know the New York Times and other organizations are absolutely petitioning at all times of day and night to gain access into Gaza so that they can report on the ground. Journalists like Marie Colvin never wanted to be embedded with troops. She wanted to go in and see the situation for herself. But at the moment, both Egypt and Israel are restricting access. They are saying, they're pointing to the dangers of operating there. But that does leave us reliant, as Jodie said, on people to whom the war has come, local journalists who are now reporting on their own communities at huge risk to themselves, being our eyes and ears on the world.
Well, and this is one thing that's strikingly different. So often when we think of people with dangerous jobs, first responders, for instance, or even foreign correspondents who are going to a conflict zone, one thing that's importantly different is that, often there are people who do work that puts themselves at risk, but often while feeling relatively secure that their families are safe at home. Whereas for a lot of the reporters who are reporting on this conflict, they're putting themselves at risk to do the reporting, but the whole time that they're working, they're also wondering about the extent to which their families are safe, because their families are not much safer than they are, in many cases, on the front lines. Sarah, in addition to the and that actually is a nice segue to another question that I have. So in addition to the physical risks that journalists face reporting on the conflict, again, the risks of injury and death, doing this work exerts a significant kind of mental and emotional toll on the people who are bearing witness and trying to provide these stories. This is something that you and you in particular in the Colvin Center more broadly have been working on a bit. Can you talk a little about the psychological risks that journalists face in reporting on conflicts like these?
Yes, Marie Colvin actually suffered from post-traumatic stress, though she was very reluctant to admit it until late in her career because, it used to be seen as a sign of weakness. Journalists are finally talking about this incredibly important issue. And actually, we launched a course, a program here on journalists on the front line and the trauma that they face with the help of the Solutions Journalism Network here at the School of Communication and Journalism at Stony Brook. And the thing is, we launched that before we knew that there was going to be conflict in Israel and Gaza. And, we didn't know at the time that, journalists would be asked to view raw footage, live stream, GoPro film, cell phone material of actual killings and effectively watching murders take place in the kibbutz and at the party the party and rave that took place in Israel on October the 7th. And, I would hate to watch that kind of footage of slaughter myself, let alone be present at it. And And the worst thing for the journalists who then told what they saw is they're still not necessarily believed. You know, in this era of partisanship and accusations of fake news, journalists can no longer assume that whatever they say will be believed, because partisans are so, there's such journalists are perceived as kind of enemy combatants just by what they write or what they broadcast. And this is so wrong. It's so important to have truth tellers who can vouch for what's really going on. And as Marie did, give that voice to the voiceless.
Jodie, as reported, in fact, actually, can you pull up an article on the screen here? So, Jodie, as reported in the CPJ, journalists on all sides of this conflict have faced intimidation, harassment, threats. There have been arrests and surveillance, other forms of interference that various actors have tried to place on journalists. Many of these restrictions and arrests and surveillance have been at the hands of Israeli forces, or sometimes at the hands of Israeli citizens on the West Bank. But there have also been Gazan journalists who are often closely surveilled by Hamas. There have been Israeli and non-Palestinian journalists who have faced pushback, in many cases from their own government or from fellow citizens for reporting uncomfortable facts and kind of challenging preferred narratives. For instance, there's been really outstanding work in Haaretz and many other Israeli outlets that present a more complicated picture of the conflict than many in Israel would maybe like or feel comfortable with. Can you talk a little bit about some of the political and social risks that many journalists take reporting on conflict like this?
Let me start maybe by picking up where Sarah left off on this question of kind of psychological trauma. You know, when I became a journalist 20-something years ago, the only people who ever got any kind of safety training whatsoever were people who were expected to go into war zones, conflict zones. And the idea that you might get support for psychological injuries or trauma was almost unheard of. Now, one of the single biggest requests we get at CPJ, and not just in conflict zones actually, but internationally, is for trauma support. Journalists are dealing with highly traumatic material in all sorts of situations, not least in war and conflict situations, and need help to process that. We saw that with journalists who were reporting on Ukraine, for example. It's particularly acute if you are a journalist, often having to report on your own community. And remember, most journalists are local journalists. They're not international journalists. We tend to think of them as, as of the Marie Colvins, but most journalists are reporting on their local community. So it's really important that newsrooms and other organizations like CPJ continue to provide that psychological support. So that's one area. Other kinds of pressure that we see on journalists are online harassment. And again, this picks up on Sarah's point. Journalists are no longer always believed or trusted. And so all too often we see journalists harassed online for their documentation. They are accused of being partisan on one side or the other, and you get huge amounts of abuse and threats. Oftentimes that can lead to physical, real world threats. If you're accused of being for one side or the other, people might target you. They might release your address or the names of your family or pictures of your family even. And we've seen that repeatedly, again, not just in this conflict, but worldwide in all sorts of situations. There's also then governmental pressure. So in Israel, Israel introduced emergency laws that would allow it to ban certain kinds of reporting that was seen not to be in the interest of national security. It's already done that with one news outlet, but that puts a huge amount of pressure on journalists, particularly in Israel, to be seen to be towing a very pro-Israeli line. And you're right, there's phenomenal journalism going on inside Israel to challenge that and report a much more nuanced and a broad picture of what's going on. And then you have arrests of journalists, detention, under these kind of emergency powers. We've seen military detentions of journalists, particularly in the West Bank. Around 19 journalists have been arrested. We've seen physical attacks on journalists. It's an incredibly febrile atmosphere, and that's all outside of the kind of direct areas of Gaza that we've been talking about as particularly dangerous.
So on this question of laws, so the laws and rules regarding regulating speech and the freedom of press vary significantly, of course, from one country to another. However, there are also sort of international rules and norms that transcend individual countries and are intended to kind of provide a baseline of protections and supports for journalists operating, especially in conflict zones, but just broadly. Can you talk a little bit about some of those international rules and norms with respect to how journalists are supposed to be treated, Jodie, and to what extent are they being respected in this conflict or not?
Yeah, so one thing that was important to remember, as I think you said at the outset, it was not easy already to report out of Gaza. It was Hamas controlled territory. Journalists were not able to report freely under Hamas pre the conflict. It's an incredibly challenging environment in which reporters operate. The important thing to remember about international norms, and international human rights is that freedom of expression is one of the things under Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that is supposed to be protected and only restricted in certain circumstances. In addition, and what's important to remember in conflict is that journalists are considered civilians in a war situation and therefore should never be targeted or prevented from operating. And that's one of the important messages that we at the Committee to Protect Journalists have been stressing. Journalists must be allowed to operate. They are civilians, they are not targets, they are not engines of war and should be allowed to operate freely. And it's one of the things that we have been reiterating consistently. And it's one of the reasons why international organizations continue to push for access so that they can provide reporting that's needed for the rest of the world.
If I
So
can jump
on this point,
what Marie Colvin found, and many journalists since, is that wearing that press flak jacket is no longer protection. We see that image all the time, the helmet with press on it, the jacket with press on it, the cars that state press. And people used to feel relatively confident that they would be safe. And the idea that they've become a target, this happened not just to Marie under the Syrian regime, but to journalists who found themselves being kidnapped by ISIS and beheaded or swapped for ransom, has really changed the game. But there are disturbing trends here in the US as well, where journalists are frequently considered the enemy, as Jodie said, for reporting on things that people wish they'd shut up about. But journalists are not in the business of shutting up. That's totally contrary to everything that the profession stands for. And that's why they are so much in the crosshairs at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, so because journalists have a kind of, as a profession, we have, we're kind of oriented towards, as has already been alluded to in this conversation, providing a voice for the voiceless, sharing things that powerful people would want to keep hidden, following the truth wherever it leads. There is a sense in which there's a kind of deep, kind of structural tension, you might call it, between the work that a lot of journalists want to do and the kind of interests of various kind of partisan political actors. I guess one question is, are there ways that stakeholders could be more responsible in how they talk about journalism and journalists, especially when journalists are reporting things that they dislike or things that that they believe that journalists are just wrong about or perhaps biased? Are there ways that different stakeholders can express concerns about journalism in more responsible ways that wouldn't kind of create this incitement or vulnerability?
Yes, it's the simple answer. So look, freedom of speech is not about defending the speech that you like. The First Amendment doesn't exist to protect just the speech that you want. And therefore, particularly in the United States, which places such importance on the First Amendment. It's really vital that you have political leaders who are robust in their defense of a free press. And that means defending both the press that you like and the press that you dislike. And the kinds of language that we've heard from people like Donald Trump, in which he called journalists enemies of the people, but frankly has been repeated time and again by leaders across the world, creates an environment in which journalists become less and less safe. It kind of creates this environment in which journalists are seen to be fair game, where they can be physically threatened at political rallies or harassed online. So I think, in terms of kind of structural things, that's something that can be done. It's really important that you have laws that protect the ability of journalists to report freely, but laws mean nothing unless they're enforced, and they mean nothing if you don't have the sort of cultural environment that surrounds that also. So I think it's both cultural, a sort of political leadership, but also structural in terms of making sure that you have the laws that ensure that journalists can report freely.
In this conflict, there have been cases, for instance, in this particular conflict where Israeli ministers have have basically alleged that because Palestinian journalists were able to quickly begin documenting the events of October 7, that they must have had foreknowledge of the attack, and have different politicians have kind of basically explicitly stated that journalists who had foreknowledge of the attack or were cooperating with Hamas are legitimate military targets. What would your response be to those ministers who interpret the relationship?
I'd say hands off our journalists, frankly, because every government in the world would love to restrict what people can and can't say about them. And all we can do is keep pushing back, keep citing the right to freedom of speech, freedom of expression as a fundamental human right, as Jodie said, and keep doing our job. And I think the really encouraging news is that there are excellent journalists, both on the ground in Gaza and in Israel, reporting in as best they possibly can in incredibly challenging circumstances, and also in other war zones such as Ukraine. And I think there's, in some ways, it's a real tribute to the profession, how well journalists have been operating under pressure in these extreme conflict zones. And I really do admire everybody who's working in this field. And I hope they serve as an inspiration to others to keep fighting the good fight and being a truth teller and becoming a journalist, not to be put off by attempts by government to misrepresent them and misrepresent their work.
And I would say, loose talk can cost lives. These kinds of smears against journalists can have extremely dangerous real-world repercussions. We have seen time and time again when these kinds of unfounded accusations, and certainly those accusations were very robustly denied and then accepted, were robustly denied by the news agencies against whom they were made, and then accepted by the news outlet that made those allegations about, how did people know so quickly? But the damage is often already done. It creates in people's minds this idea that that must be true, there must be some truth behind it. And that's what gives people often the confidence to go and physically attack these journalists and threaten those journalists. So these kinds of unfounded accusations don't just damage the profession, they can have extraordinarily dangerous real world consequences. Journalists can be killed as a result of these kinds of smear campaigns.
Yeah, one thing that's really not widely understood is the fact that journalists do have to have sources. They talk to government officials, they talk to opposition leaders, they talk where they can to Hamas. That does not mean they're complicit with any of these groups at all. They need to be fearless, independent people who are loyal to their viewers, to their listeners, to their readers, not to governments, ministers, groups, etc. But they do need to talk to everybody, and that's how they fall under suspicion so unjustly.
I think that's a great note to end this conversation on. So I would like to thank both of you for joining us. Jodie Ginsberg, the president of the Committee to Protect Journalists, Sarah Baxter, the director of the Colvin Center for Foreign Reporting here at Stony Brook University. And thank you, the audience, for tuning into this important conversation. Please follow the Colvin Center for announcements for future events on related topics and other topics that are being planned for the spring semester. And please follow the CPJ for continued coverage and data on the risks that journalists are facing, both in this conflict and other conflicts worldwide. I thank you.
Thank you.